Miss Marple and the Halloween Poisoned Apple. Welcome to Velvet Clues. I'm your host Connor, and I'm delighted you've joined us for another mystery from the quiet village of St. Mary Mead. Before we begin this tale of Halloween tricks and deadly treats, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Drop a comment and let me know your location. It always warms my heart to see how far these stories travel. Now, settle in with something warm to drink, and let's step into Miss Marple's world together. Chapter 1. Carved Pumpkins and Bitter Grudges. The October afternoon had descended upon St. Mary Mead with that peculiar golden quality that autumn brings to English villages. Miss Jane Marple sat in her customary chair by the window of her cottage, adjusting her spectacles as she observed the bustling preparations in the village square. Halloween had become quite the occasion. In recent years, she reflected with a mixture of amusement and mild disapproval. In her youth, such celebrations had been far more modest affairs. The annual costume contest had grown considerably since Mrs. Dolly Bantry had taken over its organisation 5 years prior. What had once been a simple gathering of children in bedsheet ghosts had transformed into an elaborate competition, complete with professional judging and substantial prize money. This year's grand prize of £500 had attracted entries from well beyond the village boundaries, much to the consternation of several local shopkeepers who felt their establishments deserved preferential consideration. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the raised platform being constructed in the square's centre. Bunting in orange and black fluttered cheerfully in the breeze, while volunteers wrestled with hay bales and corn stalks, arranged to create an appropriately festive backdrop. The judging table had been positioned prominently at the platform's edge, adorned with a checkered cloth and an impressive array of caramel apples that gleamed like amber jewels in the afternoon light. A commotion near the baker's shop caught her eye. Horace Blackwell had emerged from his motor car with his characteristic air of self-importance. The food critic cut an imposing figure in his expensive overcoat, his substantial frame suggesting a man who took his profession quite seriously. His appearance in the village square caused an immediate stir among the gathered volunteers, several of whom exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their feelings toward the evening's appointed judge. Miss Marple had observed Mr. Blackwell on previous occasions when he had visited St. Mary Mead to review the various eating establishments. His columns in the county newspaper were notorious for their savage wit and devastating assessments. More than one proprietor had found their business significantly damaged by his pronouncements. The Bluebell Tea Room had never quite recovered from his description of their scones as having the texture and appeal of construction materials. How very interesting that Mrs. Bantry should have chosen him as judge, Miss Marple murmured to herself. Her keen blue eyes noted the tension in several faces as Blackwell made his way toward the platform. Agnes Morton, who ran the village bakery, had gone quite pale at his approach. Thomas Chen, whose small restaurant had opened just 6 months prior, seemed to be attempting to make himself invisible behind a display of pumpkins. The afternoon wore on with increasing activity as contestants began arriving to set up their displays. Miss Marple recognised most of the participants. There was young Emily Ashworth dressed as a Victorian ghost, her pale makeup expertly applied. Marcus Webb, the butcher's son, had fashioned an elaborate scarecrow costume complete with authentic-looking straw. Sarah Pemberton from the post office had created an impressive witch ensemble that would have done credit to a theatrical production, but it was the professional entries that drew the most attention. A woman Miss Marple did not recognise had arrived with several assistants, and what appeared to be theatrical quality costumes and props. The elaborate setup suggested someone who took competitions very seriously indeed. Another unfamiliar face belonged to a thin, nervous-looking man who kept consulting a notebook while adjusting his vampire costume with practiced precision. As dusk began to fall, the square took on an increasingly festive atmosphere. Jack-o'-lanterns flickered to life along the pathways, casting dancing shadows across the cobblestones. The scent of autumn leaves mingled with that of roasting chestnuts from a vendor's cart. Children began arriving in small groups, their excitement palpable as they anticipated the evening's festivities. Miss Marple noticed that someone had placed a decorative scarecrow near the judging table. Its painted face bore an unsettling grin, and its outstretched arms seemed to gesture toward the waiting caramel apples. There was something about the arrangement that struck her as oddly theatrical, though she could not immediately identify what troubled her about the scene. Horace Blackwell had taken his position at the judging table with obvious satisfaction. He examined the caramel apples with the same critical eye he brought to restaurant inspections, lifting each one to examine its coating and testing the firmness of the apple beneath. His commentary to those nearby was characteristically dismissive. "Amateur work," he announced loudly. "The coating is uneven, and the choice of apples pedestrian at best." Agnes Morton, who had contributed the apples to the tasting table, flushed deeply at this criticism. Miss Marple observed how the baker's hands clenched at her sides before she turned away abruptly. It was a small moment, but one that Miss Marple filed away in her memory alongside numerous other observations about human nature and the resentments that could fester in even the most peaceful of communities. The evening's events were about to begin. Chapter 2. A Critic's Final Verdict. The Halloween costume contest commenced promptly at 7 o'clock, with Mrs. Bantry taking her position at the microphone to address the assembled crowd. Her voice carried clearly across the square as she welcomed participants and spectators alike, reminding everyone of the rules and the generous prize that awaited the winner. The atmosphere was one of controlled excitement, with an undercurrent of tension that Miss Marple found increasingly interesting to observe. Horace Blackwell had assumed his role as judge with theatrical gravity. He sat behind the tasting table with a leather-bound notebook and an expensive fountain pen, making a great show of his preparations. Before him the caramel apples gleamed under the newly installed electric lights that Mrs. Bantry had insisted upon for proper illumination of the proceedings. There were perhaps 24 apples arranged on decorative platters, each one representing hours of work by Agnes Morton, who had volunteered to provide refreshments for the judges and officials. The first contestants began their presentations, moving across the platform in a parade of creativity and varying degrees of skill. Miss Marple watched from her vantage point near the War Memorial as each participant performed their brief presentation before Blackwell's critical gaze. His comments, even from a distance, appeared characteristically cutting. Several contestants left the platform with expressions suggesting they had been less than pleased with his assessment. It was during the presentation of Marcus Webb's scarecrow costume that Miss Marple noticed something peculiar. Blackwell had reached for one of the caramel apples, lifting it with evident anticipation. But before biting into it, he paused, examining the surface with a frown. He set it down and selected another, only to repeat the same process. On his third selection, he seemed satisfied and raised the apple to his mouth. Miss Marple found herself leaning forward slightly, her attention caught by something she could not quite identify. The apple Blackwell had chosen appeared identical to the others, but there was something about the way the light caught its surface that seemed different. She was still puzzling over this observation when several things happened in rapid succession. Blackwell took a substantial bite from the caramel apple, chewing with the deliberate care of a professional taster. His expression changed almost immediately from satisfaction to confusion, and then to unmistakable alarm. The apple fell from his hand, landing on the platform with a dull thud as Blackwell clutched at his throat. His face had gone from its usual ruddy colour to an alarming shade of grey. The crowd's reaction was initially one of confusion. Several people laughed uncertainly, thinking this might be part of some elaborate Halloween performance. But when Blackwell collapsed from his chair, falling heavily to the wooden boards, the laughter died immediately. Screams erupted from several directions, and there was a sudden surge of people toward the platform. Dr. Haydock, who had been enjoying a cup of cider near the refreshment tent, immediately pushed through the crowd. Miss Marple watched as he knelt beside the fallen critic, checking for vital signs with professional efficiency. The doctor's face grew increasingly grave as he conducted his examination. After what seemed an eternity, but could only have been minutes, he looked up at Mrs. Bantry, who had rushed to his side. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done," Dr. Haydock announced in a voice that carried clearly, despite his obvious attempt at discretion. "The gentleman has expired. The cause appears to be some form of rapid-acting poison, given the symptoms I observed." The word poison rippled through the crowd like a physical force. Panic began to spread as people backed away from the platform, and particularly from the table of caramel apples. Parents grabbed their children, pulling them close. Several people began shouting for the police, while others simply stood frozen in shock. Miss Marple remained where she was, her keen eyes taking in every detail of the scene. She noted how Agnes Morton had gone completely white, her hand pressed against her mouth. Thomas Chen had actually taken several steps backward, as though physically recoiling from the tragedy. Sarah Pemberton was clutching at Mrs. Bantry's arm while Emily Ashworth had begun to cry quietly. The professional contestants reacted differently. The woman with the theatrical costumes had pulled out a mobile phone and was speaking urgently into it. The thin man in the vampire costume had not moved at all but stood staring at Blackwell's body with an expression that Miss Marple found difficult to interpret. It might have been shock, or perhaps something else entirely. Inspector Slack arrived within 20 minutes, having been summoned from his evening meal at the Rose and Crown. His expression suggested considerable displeasure at having his dinner interrupted, though he went about securing the scene with reasonable efficiency. Yellow tape was strung around the platform and the judging table. The caramel apples were carefully collected as evidence, while Dr. Haydock supervised the removal of Horace Blackwell's body. Miss Marple observed that 3 of the apples showed signs of having been handled. The one Blackwell had bitten into naturally, but also the 2 he had examined and rejected before making his fatal selection. She found this detail particularly interesting, though she said nothing to Inspector Slack, who had not yet noticed her presence among the crowd of onlookers. As the evening's festivities came to their abrupt and tragic end, Miss Marple made her way slowly back to her cottage. Her mind was already working through the implications of what she had witnessed. Someone in St. Mary Mead had committed murder, and had done so in a remarkably bold fashion. The question that troubled her most, however, was whether Horace Blackwell had been the intended victim, or whether something far more sinister had been planned. The carved pumpkins continued to grin their empty grins along the pathways, their flickering candles casting shadows that seemed to dance with secrets. Chapter 3. Bitter Reviews and Broken Businesses. The morning after Horace Blackwell's dramatic demise dawned grey and dreary with a persistent drizzle that seemed to reflect the sombre mood that had settled over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple rose early as was her custom, and after a light breakfast found herself drawn once again to her window overlooking the village square. The Halloween decorations that had seemed so festive the previous evening now appeared almost macabre in the pale morning light. Inspector Slack had established a temporary headquarters in the village hall, and Miss Marple could see various official-looking persons coming and going with files and equipment. The caramel apples had been sent to the county laboratory for analysis, though Dr. Haydock had already confirmed his preliminary assessment that cyanide poisoning was the likely cause of death. The speed of Blackwell's collapse left little doubt about the potency of the poison used. Miss Marple decided that a morning visit to the shops might prove illuminating. It was remarkable how much information could be gathered through seemingly innocent conversations about everyday matters. She donned her mackintosh and sturdy walking shoes and made her way into the village proper. Her first stop was Agnes Morton's bakery, though she found the shop closed despite the hour. A hand-lettered sign in the window apologized for the inconvenience and promised reopening soon. Through the glass, Miss Marple could see Agnes sitting at one of the small tables, her head in her hands. The baker looked up at the sound of Miss Marple's gentle knock, and after a moment's hesitation came to unlock the door. "Oh, Miss Marple," Agnes said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I suppose you've come about the apples. Everyone will think it was my fault. Those were my caramel apples. I made every single one of them." Miss Marple entered the shop and settled herself at a table with the air of someone prepared to listen. "Do tell me about it, dear. I'm sure you took every proper precaution with the food preparation." Agnes poured tea with shaking hands and began to speak. The story that emerged was one Miss Marple had half expected. 3 years prior, Horace Blackwell had visited the bakery shortly after Agnes had expanded her business to include a small tea room. His review had been devastating. He had described her pastries as suitable only for those with no discernment, and her tea service as reminiscent of a railway station cafeteria. The impact on her business had been immediate and severe. "I almost lost everything," Agnes said bitterly. "It took me 2 years to rebuild my customer base, and even now people still remember that horrible review. When Mrs. Bantry asked me to provide the apples for the contest, I thought it might be a chance to show everyone that I could produce quality work. And now this happens." Miss Marple made sympathetic sounds while noting certain details. "Did you prepare all the apples yourself, dear?" "Every single one," Agnes confirmed. "I worked on them all day, yesterday in my kitchen upstairs. They never left my sight until I delivered them to the square at 5 o'clock. "And after delivery," Miss Marple inquired gently, Were they left unattended at any point? Agnes frowned in concentration. Well, yes, I suppose they were. I had to help with setting up other tables and arranging the platform decorations. The apples sat on the judging table for perhaps an hour before the contest began. Anyone could have approached them during that time. After leaving the bakery, Miss Marple made her way to the Golden Dragon restaurant, where she found Thomas Chen in similarly distressed circumstances. The small establishment was open but empty of customers. Thomas greeted her with obvious anxiety, his usual cheerful demeanour completely absent. "Miss Marple, I suppose you want to know about Blackwell's review of my restaurant," Thomas said, without preamble. "It destroyed me. 6 months of work building my business, and he wrote that my cooking was an insult to Chinese cuisine, and that I should consider a different profession." The young restaurateur's hands trembled as he poured tea. "My family had saved for years to help me open this place. We invested everything we had. After Blackwell's review appeared, customers stopped coming. I've been operating at a loss ever since. My parents may lose their retirement savings because of that man's cruelty." Miss Marple sipped her tea and studied Thomas carefully. "Had you any contact with Mr. Blackwell since his review appeared?" Thomas shook his head. "I avoided him completely. When I heard he would be judging last night, I almost didn't attend. But I thought perhaps if I won the prize money, it might help save my business." His laugh was bitter. "Instead, I'm probably a suspect in his murder." The post office was Miss Marple's next destination, where she found Sarah Pemberton behind the counter, looking exhausted. The postmistress had dark circles under her eyes and started nervously when Miss Marple entered. "I didn't sleep at all last night," Sarah confessed as she sorted mail with mechanical precision. "All I could think about was what Blackwell wrote about my mother's guest house. She had to close it down after his review. He called it a health hazard and suggested the building should be condemned. Mother never recovered from the shame. She died 6 months later." Miss Marple's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "How very difficult for you, dear." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Everyone knows I blamed him for Mother's death. I've never made a secret of it. Inspector Slack has already questioned me twice this morning. He seems convinced I had motive and opportunity." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "The truth is, Miss Marple, I'm glad he's dead. Does that make me a terrible person?" As Miss Marple made her way home through the persistent drizzle, she reflected on the conversations of the morning. 3 people with clear motives, 3 people who had suffered genuine harm from Horace Blackwell's cruel assessments. Any one of them might have seized the opportunity for revenge. But something about the method troubled her. The poison had been administered with considerable boldness in front of dozens of witnesses. That suggested either desperation or careful calculation, and she was beginning to suspect it might be the latter. Chapter 4. The Marked Apple and the Syringe. Inspector Slack's investigation proceeded with his characteristic bluster, but Miss Marple had to admit that he was being reasonably thorough in his evidence collection. By late morning, the results from the laboratory had confirmed cyanide poisoning and revealed something else of considerable interest. The poisoned apple had shown evidence of injection with a fine needle suggesting that the toxin had been introduced directly into the fruit rather than mixed with the caramel coating. Miss Marple learned these details from Dr. Haydock, who stopped by her cottage on his rounds. The good doctor had developed a grudging respect for her observational skills over the years, and occasionally shared information he felt might be relevant to her curiosity about village affairs. "The interesting thing is the precision of it," Haydock explained as he accepted a cup of tea. "The injection was made at the stem end where it would be least visible. Whoever did this had some knowledge of anatomy, or at least understood how to administer injections properly. The needle used was quite fine, probably a standard medical syringe. Miss Marple considered this information carefully. And the other apples, doctor, were they examined for similar tampering?" Haydock nodded. "All of them were tested. Only the one Blackwell consumed showed any trace of poison, though there was something odd about 3 of them, including the fatal one. Each had a tiny marking carved into the skin beneath the caramel coating. Almost impossible to see unless you knew to look for it." "A marking?" Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. "What sort of marking?" "Small initials carved with something very sharp. The poisoned apple was marked with the letters HB. The other 2 had different initials that haven't yet been identified." The doctor paused. The working theory is that the poisoned apple was specifically marked to ensure Blackwell would select it, but he examined 2 others before choosing the fatal one Miss Marple pointed out. I observed that myself. He seemed to be looking for something specific. That's the puzzle, isn't it? Haydock agreed. Why mark 3 apples with different initials, unless the markings serve some purpose beyond identification? Inspector Slack thinks the killer may have marked multiple apples to confuse the investigation, but I'm not convinced that explanation is entirely satisfactory. After the doctor departed, Miss Marple sat in thoughtful contemplation. The marked apples suggested premeditation and careful planning. Someone had taken the time to carve initials into the fruit before coating them with caramel. The question was whether those initials identified intended victims or served some other purpose entirely. Her musings were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Bantry, who appeared at the door in a state of considerable agitation. Her usually immaculate appearance was somewhat dishevelled, and her eyes showed signs of recent tears. Jane, the foreman, simply had to talk to someone who might understand, Mrs. Bantry said as she collapsed into a chair. Inspector Slack has been questioning me for hours. He seems to think I might have orchestrated this whole terrible affair as some sort of publicity stunt gone wrong. Miss Marple poured fresh tea and made soothing sounds. I'm quite certain the inspector is simply being thorough in his investigation, dear. Tell me, did you observe anything unusual during the set-up yesterday evening? Mrs. Bantry dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Well, now that you mention it, there was something rather odd. I saw someone near the judging table during the set-up. They appeared to be examining the apples quite closely. At the time, I thought perhaps they were just admiring Agnes's work, but in retrospect the behaviour seemed rather furtive. Could you identify this person? Miss Marple asked gently. That's just it. I'm not entirely certain, Mrs. Bantry replied. The light was beginning to fade, and they were partially obscured by the decorative scarecrow. But I had the impression it might have been that woman with all the professional costume equipment. You know, the one who seemed to have assistants and theatrical props. Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. And did you happen to notice if this person was carrying anything? A bag, perhaps, or any sort of container? Mrs. Bantry frowned in concentration. There might have been a small case or bag. I really can't be certain. Everything was such a chaos with people rushing about making final preparations. She paused, then added, There was something else, though. I saw someone who looked like they might be taking photographs of the apple display, but again, I couldn't be certain who it was. After Mrs. Bantry departed, Miss Marple decided that a visit to the village hall might prove enlightening. Inspector Slack had commandeered the main room for his investigation, and she found him examining a collection of items laid out on a large table. Among them were the remaining caramel apples, each now sealed in evidence bags. Ah, Miss Marple, Inspector Slack said without much enthusiasm. I suppose you've come to offer your observations. The inspector's relationship with Miss Marple was complex. He found her meddling irritating, but had learned through experience that her insights could be valuable even if he was reluctant to admit it. I merely wondered if you might have identified the source of the syringe used to inject the poison, Miss Marple said mildly. It seems to me that such an item would be relatively easy to trace. Inspector Slack's expression suggested he had already considered this line of inquiry. We're checking with local pharmacies and medical suppliers. Unfortunately, syringes can be purchased quite easily these days for various legitimate purposes. We've also found something else that might interest you, though. I'm not sure of its significance. He indicated a small object in an evidence bag. It appeared to be a decorative item of some sort, a small candy thermometer designed to look like a Halloween ornament. The thermometer had a sharp metal probe that could easily have been mistaken for a decorative element. Found this in the rubbish bin near the platform, Inspector Slack explained. It's the right size and shape to have been used for the injection. Been sent off for testing, but I'd wager we'll find traces of cyanide on it. Miss Marple examined the thermometer carefully without touching the evidence bag. How very clever, she murmured. Disguised as a piece of seasonal decoration, it would attract no particular attention if someone was seen carrying it, and afterward it could simply be discarded among the general refuse. As she walked home that evening, Miss Marple found her thoughts turning to the question of method and opportunity. The injection had required access to the apples, time to make the careful carving of initials and knowledge of which apple Blackwell would ultimately select. That last point particularly troubled her. How could the killer have ensured their victim would choose the specific poisoned apple unless there was some way of directing his selection? Chapter 5. 3 suspects and 3 alibis. The investigation entered its 3rd day with Inspector Slack focusing his attention on the 3 individuals who had the strongest apparent motives. Agnes Morton, Thomas Chen, and Sarah Pemberton had each been questioned extensively, and their alibis during the critical period examined with considerable scrutiny. Miss Marple found herself increasingly interested in the inspector's findings, though she was beginning to suspect that the obvious suspects might not be the correct ones. Dr. Haydock provided an update during his morning call. Agnes claims she was helping arrange the hay bales on the platform during the hour before the contest began, he reported. Several witnesses confirm seeing her there, though no one can account for her whereabouts for approximately 15 minutes when she said she needed to use the facilities in the village hall. And Mr. Chen, Miss Marple inquired. Thomas Chen was setting up his restaurant display, which was part of the vendor section near the refreshment tent, Haydock continued. He has witnesses for most of that time, but again there's a gap of perhaps 10 minutes when he could have slipped away unnoticed. As for Sarah Pemberton, she was working at the registration table, but stepped away briefly to fetch additional forms from the post office. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. So each of our prime suspects had a brief window of opportunity to approach the apple display without attracting attention. How very convenient. The doctor caught something in her tone. You sound sceptical about their guilt. I'm sceptical about things being quite so neat, Miss Marple replied. In my experience, real crimes rarely arrange themselves so conveniently for investigators. 3 people with strong motives and 3 suspiciously convenient gaps in their alibis. It almost seems designed to draw attention to them, doesn't it? That afternoon, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. The woman with the professional costume equipment whom she had observed at the contest appeared at her door introducing herself as Vivian Hartley. She was an elegant woman in her late 40s, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to success. Miss Marple, I've heard from several people in the village that you have a remarkable talent for understanding puzzling situations, Mrs. Hartley began, after accepting an invitation to tea. I wonder if I might discuss something with you that's been troubling me greatly. Miss Marple gestured for her guest to continue. I'm a professional costume designer and competitive cosplayer, Mrs. Hartley explained. I travel to contests throughout the country and have built quite a successful business around it. That's why I was so upset by Blackwell's review of my work last year. She paused, her expression pained. He attended a costume exhibition where I was displaying my pieces. His article described my work as derivative and lacking in creativity. He particularly savaged a Victorian ensemble that I'd spent 6 months creating. The impact on your business, Miss Marple prompted gently. It was devastating, Mrs. Hartley admitted. Several high-profile clients cancelled their commissions. I lost contracts worth thousands of pounds. I've been rebuilding my reputation ever since, but the damage Blackwell did still affects me. When I learned he would be judging this contest, I seriously considered withdrawing, but pride wouldn't let me. Miss Marple studied her visitor carefully. You were observed near the judging table examining the apples during the set-up period. Can you explain your interest in them? Mrs. Hartley flushed slightly. I was looking at the craftsmanship, actually. I have an interest in all forms of decorative arts, including food presentation. The caramel work was quite professional, and I wanted to see the technique up close. She met Miss Marple's gaze directly. But I certainly didn't poison any of them. I was never alone with the display, and I had no syringe or poison in my possession. After Mrs. Hartley departed, Miss Marple made her way to the village hall where she found Inspector Slack reviewing statements. The inspector looked up with his usual expression of mild exasperation. I suppose you've come to tell me I'm investigating the wrong people, Inspector Slack said. Not at all, Inspector Miss Marple replied serenely, though I wonder if you've given much thought to the other contestants. There was a rather nervous gentleman in a vampire costume who seemed quite interested in the proceedings. That would be Edmund Price, Inspector Slack, consulted his notes. Professional costume contest participant. He's been cleared, has an alibi for the critical period. He was being interviewed by someone from the local newspaper about his costume techniques. The reporter confirms they were together for nearly an hour. How very thorough, Miss Marple observed. And what of the marked apples? Have the other initials been identified? Inspector Slack's expression grew troubled. That's where things become more complicated. The poisoned apple was marked HB for Horace Blackwell, obviously, but one of the others was marked TH and the third bore the letters MW. We haven't been able to determine who those initials might refer to. Miss Marple felt a cold certainty settling in her chest. Mr. Chen's name is Thomas, but what is his middle name? The inspector checked his notes. Henry. Thomas Henry Chen. His eyes widened slightly. And Marcus Webb, the butcher's son, who was in the scarecrow costume, his initials would be MW. So 3 apples were marked with initials corresponding to 3 different people, Miss Marple said quietly. That suggests something rather different from a simple revenge killing, doesn't it, Inspector? Inspector Slack stared at the evidence bags containing the remaining apples. You're suggesting multiple intended victims. But only Blackwell consumed a poisoned apple. Or Miss Marple said carefully, perhaps none of them were the intended victims at all. Perhaps Mr. Blackwell's death was meant to obscure something else entirely. The inspector's expression showed he was beginning to grasp the implications. If that's true, then we're dealing with something far more sinister than revenge for bad reviews. Miss Marple nodded gravely. I believe we are Inspector, and I think we need to examine very carefully who else might have had access to those apples and what their true objective might have been. Chapter 6. Insurance Policies and Children's Treats. The revelation about the multiple marked apples cast the entire investigation in a dramatically different light. Inspector Slack had immediately ordered all the remaining apples tested for poison, with results that proved both alarming and enlightening. While the apple bearing Horace Blackwell's initials was the only one containing a lethal dose of cyanide, the other marked apples showed trace amounts of a different substance that the laboratory identified as a mild sedative. Miss Marple received this information from Dr. Haydock, who appeared at her cottage early the following morning looking deeply troubled. The other marked apples weren't meant to kill, he explained. The sedative would have caused drowsiness and mild discomfort, but nothing life-threatening. It's almost as if they were meant to create symptoms that could be attributed to food poisoning rather than deliberate poisoning. And the unmarked apples, Miss Marple inquired. That's where it gets truly disturbing, Haydock said grimly. Inspector Slack ordered testing of all the remaining apples from Agnes Morton's batch. Turns out every single one of them contained traces of the same sedative found in the marked apples. Not enough to be immediately dangerous, but certainly enough to make children ill if they consumed them. Miss Marple felt a chill run through her. All of the apples were contaminated, so Mr. Blackwell's death wasn't the primary objective at all. It would seem not Haydock agreed. The working theory now is that someone poisoned the entire batch of apples that were meant to be distributed to children during trick-or-treating later that evening. Blackwell's murder with the single lethal dose may have been intended to draw attention away from the larger plot. This revelation prompted an immediate expansion of the investigation. Inspector Slack, with considerable assistance from the county police, began examining who might benefit from a mass poisoning of children's treats. The answer when it emerged was both shocking and sadly predictable. Miss Marple learned the details during an afternoon visit to the village hall, where Inspector Slack had assembled his evidence. The inspector had lost much of his usual bluster, replaced by grim determination. We've been looking into Agnes Morton's financial situation more closely, Inspector Slack explained. Turns out she's heavily in debt, far worse than anyone realized. Her business has been failing for years, not just since Blackwell's review. She took out substantial loans to expand the tea room, and then couldn't maintain the revenue to cover them, and her insurance coverage, Miss Marple prompted, having already guessed where this was leading. Substantial liability coverage for her business, Inspector Slack confirmed. If children had become ill from consuming treats she'd provided, even if she wasn't directly negligent, her insurance would have paid out significant damages, enough to settle all her debts, and probably leave her with a tidy sum besides. But something went wrong with her plan, Miss Marple observed. Blackwell's death complicated everything, Inspector Slack agreed. Instead of a gradual discovery of sick children that could be blamed on accidental contamination, we had an immediate murder investigation. All the apples became evidence before they could be distributed. The plan fell apart completely. Miss Marple considered this theory carefully. It explained many things, including the peculiar method of marking certain apples. The initials hadn't been meant to identify specific victims, but rather to create confusion about the poisoner's intent. By marking apples with the initials of people who had obvious grudges against Blackwell, Agnes had hoped to direct suspicion away from herself when the murder was discovered. However, Miss Marple said slowly, "I'm troubled by certain aspects of this theory, Inspector. Agnes is certainly capable of desperation, but the technical knowledge required to execute such a plan seems beyond her capabilities." "What do you mean?" Inspector Slack asked. "The cyanide injection was performed with considerable skill," Miss Marple explained. "The marked apples were prepared in such a way that Blackwell would be likely to select the fatal one, and someone had to have knowledge of insurance fraud schemes and confidence that such a plan would work. Agnes strikes me as someone who might be driven to desperate measures, but not someone with the sophistication to devise such an elaborate scheme." Inspector Slack's expression suggested he had already considered this point. "We're looking into her associates and anyone she might have consulted for advice, though so far we haven't found any obvious connections to people with that sort of expertise." That evening Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the village square as darkness fell. The Halloween decorations had been taken down, and the cheerful, festive atmosphere had been replaced by an uneasy quiet. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead was someone capable of planning mass poisoning of children as part of an insurance fraud scheme. Someone who had been willing to murder Horace Blackwell to provide cover for their larger crime. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She opened it to find Mrs. Bantry standing on the step, looking agitated. "Jane?" "I've remembered something that might be important," Mrs. Bantry said without preamble. "That person I saw examining the apples during setup. I've been racking my brain trying to recall more details, and I've just realized something. They were wearing gloves. Not costume gloves, but those thin latex gloves that medical people use." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "Are you quite certain?" "Absolutely certain," Mrs. Bantry confirmed. "At the time, I thought perhaps they were concerned about food safety or hygiene. But now it seems rather more sinister, doesn't it? Someone taking precautions not to leave fingerprints. This new detail suggested premeditation and careful planning. Someone had gone to the trouble of wearing gloves while handling the apples, knowing that their involvement would eventually be investigated. That level of care implied both guilty knowledge and confidence in their ability to avoid detection. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Bantry for the information, and after her friend departed, sat in deep contemplation. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves into a pattern, but that pattern suggested something far more complex than a simple insurance fraud scheme. Someone with medical knowledge, someone who had access to the apples, and someone who stood to benefit from creating chaos and confusion in the investigation. The answer when came to her was so obvious that she wondered why she hadn't seen it sooner. Chapter 7. A Photographer's Darkroom Secrets. The revelation came to Miss Marple during the quiet hours of early morning, when the village lay sleeping beneath a thin layer of frost. She had been reviewing everything she had observed about the Halloween evening when a chance memory surfaced. Mrs. Bantry had mentioned someone taking photographs of the apple display, but that detail had been overshadowed by more pressing concerns. Now Miss Marple found herself wondering who would have been photographing caramel apples, and more importantly, why. After a light breakfast, Miss Marple made her way to the village hall where Inspector Slack had set up a temporary evidence room. She found him examining reports with a weary expression that suggested another sleepless night. "Inspector, I wonder if you might indulge a question," Miss Marple began. "Did anyone report seeing a photographer at the contest setup? Someone taking pictures of the apple display specifically?" Inspector Slack consulted his notes with evident puzzlement. Several people mentioned cameras and phones. These days, everyone photographs everything. "Why do you ask?" "Because," Miss Marple said carefully, "someone went to considerable trouble to document those apples before the poisoning occurred. That suggests they wanted evidence of the original arrangement. Perhaps to prove they hadn't tampered with them, or perhaps to have a record for some other purpose entirely." The inspector's expression sharpened. "We did collect some photographs from witnesses. Let me find them." He rummaged through a box of evidence bags and produced several printed images. Most showed costume contestants, but 3 photographs focused specifically on the apple display taken from different angles. These were submitted by Vivian Hartley, Inspector Slack said. She claimed she was documenting the food presentation for her professional portfolio. But now that you mention it, the level of detail seems excessive for casual interest. Miss Marple studied the photographs intently. They showed the apple arrangement with remarkable clarity, including close-up shots that revealed the texture of the caramel coating. What struck her immediately was that one photograph showed an apple with a barely visible marking on its surface. The initials were just discernible if one knew to look for them. Inspector Slack noticed her attention. That's the apple marked M.W., Marcus Webb's initials. The photographer would have had to be looking very carefully to notice such a small detail, or Miss Marple suggested they knew it was there because they had carved it themselves. She looked up at the inspector. I believe we should examine Mrs. Hartley's background more carefully, specifically her access to medical supplies and her knowledge of chemistry. The investigation into Vivian Hartley's background revealed several troubling facts. Her costume design business, while successful, was heavily dependent on winning competition prizes. She had suffered significant financial losses after Horace Blackwell's negative review. More significantly, her late husband had been a pharmaceutical chemist, and she had inherited his extensive home laboratory when he died 2 years prior. We found records of chemical purchases Inspector Slack reported that afternoon, including compounds that could be used to synthesize cyanide. She claimed they were for fabric dyes and treatment processes. Without direct evidence linking her to the actual poisoning, we can't make an arrest. Miss Marple considered this information. What about the sedative found in the other apples? Could that be traced to her supplies? The laboratory is working on that now, Inspector Slack said. But even if we prove she had access to the materials, we still need to establish how and when she contaminated the apples. Agnes Morton insists her kitchen was secure and that she watched the apples until delivery. That evening, Miss Marple paid a visit to Agnes Morton, who had reopened her bakery despite the ongoing scandal. The baker looked exhausted, but greeted Miss Marple with cautious warmth. Agnes, dear, Miss Marple began gently, I need to ask you something rather important. When you were preparing the caramel apples, did you have any visitors to your kitchen? Agnes frowned in concentration. Well, yes, actually. Mrs. Hartley stopped by in the afternoon. She said she was interested in learning the technique for future reference. Professional curiosity, she called it. And did you leave her alone at any point? Miss Marple asked. Agnes paled visibly. I stepped out to answer the telephone. It couldn't have been more than 5 minutes. When I returned, she was examining the finished apples, saying how beautiful they looked. Oh, Miss Marple, you don't think? Miss Marple patted her hand reassuringly. I think you should tell Inspector Slack about this conversation, dear. It may prove quite significant. The next morning brought a breakthrough. The laboratory confirmed that the sedative found in the apples matched a pharmaceutical compound that Vivian Hartley had purchased 6 months earlier. Confronted with this evidence, along with Agnes Morton's testimony about the unsupervised visit, Mrs. Hartley's carefully constructed alibi began to crumble. Chapter 8. The Candy Thermometer Confession. Inspector Slack's interrogation of Vivian Hartley took place in the village hall with Miss Marple present as a witness at the inspector's somewhat reluctant invitation. The costume designer maintained her composure initially, but the accumulation of evidence had clearly shaken her confidence. Mrs. Hartley Inspector Slack began, We have testimony placing you alone in Agnes Morton's kitchen with access to the caramel apples. We have chemical analysis linking substances in your possession to those found in the contaminated apples. And we have your own photographs documenting the apple display in suspicious detail. I think it's time you told us the truth. Vivian Hartley's elegant facade finally cracked. Her hands trembled as she clasped them in her lap, and when she spoke, her voice was barely audible. I never meant to kill anyone. That wasn't part of the plan at all. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. What was the plan, Mrs. Hartley? The woman took a shuddering breath. I needed money desperately. My business was failing, and I had debts I couldn't pay. Someone approached me several months ago with a proposition. They said they knew about my financial troubles and my husband's laboratory equipment. They offered me a substantial sum to help execute an insurance fraud scheme. Someone approached you. Inspector Slack's tone sharpened. Who was this person? I never knew their real identity, Vivian insisted. We communicated through anonymous messages and dead drops. They provided detailed instructions about contaminating the apples with a mild sedative. The idea was to make children ill enough to trigger insurance claims but not seriously harm them. I was supposed to receive £20,000 for my part. And the cyanide, Miss Marple asked quietly. Where did that fit into the plan? Vivian's eyes filled with tears. That wasn't supposed to happen. The instructions were very clear about the dosage. Only enough sedative to cause temporary illness. When I delivered the prepared syringes hidden inside that candy thermometer, the person who collected them assured me everything was calibrated correctly. Inspector Slack exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. You're saying someone else actually injected the apples. You just prepared the materials. Yes, Vivian said eagerly. I provided the sedative solution and the thermometer syringe. But I never had direct access to inject the apples myself. That was done by whoever hired me. She paused, then added, I photographed the apples to prove I hadn't tampered with them during setup. I was afraid I might be blamed if something went wrong. Which it did, Miss Marple observed, because someone substituted cyanide for sedative in at least one of your prepared syringes. They used your conspiracy to commit insurance fraud as cover for murder. Vivian nodded miserably. When Blackwell died, I realized I'd been used. Whoever hired me had always intended to kill him. They needed my laboratory access and my financial desperation, but they never planned to pay me. They planned to let me take the blame for murder. Inspector Slack's expression was grim. We'll need everything you can tell us about these anonymous communications. Every message, every instruction, every detail about the dead drops where you left the materials. Vivian pulled a folded envelope from her handbag. I kept copies of everything. I thought I might need insurance of my own. She spread several printed messages on the table. The communications had been sent through an encrypted email service, but they contained details about the contamination plan, including specific instructions about where to leave the prepared syringes. The dead drop was inside one of the decorative pumpkins in the village square, Vivian explained. I left the thermometer syringe there the morning of the contest. Whoever collected it had access to the apple display during setup. They would have had time to inject multiple apples and arrange them according to some predetermined selection process. Miss Marple studied the messages with interest. These instructions are quite detailed. Whoever wrote them had considerable knowledge of both chemistry and insurance fraud procedures. They also knew enough about the Halloween contest arrangements to plan the timing perfectly. Inspector Slack was already making notes. We'll trace these email accounts and examine the pumpkin for forensic evidence. Mrs. Hartley, you'll be charged with conspiracy and reckless endangerment. But if you cooperate fully in identifying your co-conspirator, we may be able to negotiate reduced charges. After Vivian Hartley was taken into custody, Miss Marple remained in the village hall examining the evidence. The messages revealed careful planning and attention to detail. Whoever had orchestrated this scheme had anticipated multiple contingencies and had been willing to commit murder to achieve their ultimate objective. But what was that objective? The insurance fraud alone seemed insufficient motivation for such an elaborate plot. Horace Blackwell's death had actually undermined the insurance scheme by triggering a murder investigation before the contaminated apples could be distributed. Unless Miss Marple thought carefully, unless Blackwell's death was the true objective all along, and the insurance fraud was merely a convenient cover story. That evening she sat by her window watching the village square and thinking about motives. Someone had wanted Horace Blackwell dead badly enough to orchestrate an elaborate conspiracy. They had used Vivian Hartley's desperation and Agnes Morton's financial troubles as camouflage. They had prepared multiple marked apples to create confusion about intended victims, and they had been willing to risk harming children to achieve their goal. The answer, Miss Marple realized, lay not in who hated Blackwell for his reviews, but in who stood to gain most from his death. And that required understanding what Horace Blackwell had been investigating beyond his restaurant critiques. Chapter 9. A critic's final investigation revealed. The breakthrough in understanding Horace Blackwell's murder came from an unexpected source. Miss Marple had requested that Inspector Slack examine the critic's personal effects more thoroughly, particularly any notebooks or files he might have brought with him to St. Mary Mead. The inspector initially dismissed this as unnecessary, but relented when Miss Marple pointed out that professional critics typically maintain detailed records of their observations. What they discovered proved illuminating. Among Blackwell's belongings was a leather portfolio containing notes for an article he had been preparing. The subject was not restaurant reviews, but rather an exposé of fraudulent practices in the competitive costume and craft show circuit. He had been investigating allegations of bribery, judge manipulation, and organised schemes to fix competition outcomes. Inspector Slack read aloud from Blackwell's notes. Several professional contestants have been accused of paying judges for favourable scores. More seriously, there are suggestions of an organised network that controls which contestants win major prizes across multiple regional competitions. The system allows certain individuals to dominate the circuit and collect substantial prize money, while legitimate competitors are systematically excluded. Miss Marple examined the portfolio contents with growing interest. Did Mr. Blackwell name any specific individuals in his investigation? He did, Inspector Slack confirmed, turning pages. And this is where it gets interesting. He specifically mentions Vivian Hartley as someone whose competition success seemed statistically improbable. But more significantly, he had begun investigating the contest organisers themselves. Look at this notation. The inspector pointed to a page where Blackwell had written in bold letters. Check local organiser backgrounds. Pattern suggests some are connected to the prize-fixing network. Possible money laundering through contest prize payments. And underneath was a name that made both of them pause. Dolly Bantry query financial connections to costume supply companies. Miss Marple felt a cold certainty settling over her. Mrs. Bantry had organised the Halloween contest for 5 years. She had selected the judges, arranged the prize money, and managed all the financial aspects. If Blackwell had suspected her of being involved in a prize-fixing scheme, his presence as a judge would have posed an existential threat. "We need to examine Mrs. Bantry's financial records," Inspector Slack said, reaching for his telephone, "and we need to do it quietly. If she realises we're investigating her, she might destroy evidence." The investigation into Dolly Bantry's affairs proceeded with discretion over the following days. What emerged was a picture of a woman living well beyond her apparent means. She had purchased expensive property, made substantial investments, and maintained a lifestyle that seemed incompatible with her late husband's modest pension. More significantly, financial records showed regular payments from several costume and craft supply companies. Inspector Slack's inquiries revealed these companies were connected to the very competition network Blackwell had been investigating. Mrs. Bantry had been receiving commissions for steering prize money towards specific contestants who would then purchase supplies from the network's affiliated vendors. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity, Inspector Slack explained to Miss Marple. Contest organisers like Mrs. Bantry would arrange for certain contestants to win, ensuring they received substantial prize money. These contestants would then be required to purchase costumes and supplies from specific vendors at inflated prices. The vendors would kick back a percentage to the organisers. Everyone in the network profited except the legitimate competitors who were shut out, and Mr. Blackwell's investigation threatened to expose the entire operation, Miss Marple observed. Exactly, Inspector Slack agreed. If his article had been published, it would have destroyed Mrs. Bantry's reputation and likely led to criminal charges. She stood to lose everything, but there was still the question of how Mrs. Bantry had executed the murder. Inspector Slack's timeline established that she had been visible throughout the evening greeting guests and managing the contest logistics. She couldn't have personally injected the apples during the critical period, unless Miss Marple said thoughtfully she had an accomplice, someone who could move freely around the contest area without attracting suspicion, someone who had been carefully positioned to access the apple display at the necessary moment. They reviewed the statements and witness accounts, looking for anyone who had been working closely with Mrs. Bantry that evening. The answer emerged from the registration records. Thomas Chen had been assigned to help with setup specifically at Mrs. Bantry's request. He had been positioned near the judging table during the crucial period. Inspector Slack immediately ordered Chen brought in for questioning. The young restaurateur arrived looking terrified, but maintained his innocence. He knew nothing about poisoned apples or conspiracy schemes. Mrs. Bantry had simply asked him to help with arrangements, and he had been grateful for the opportunity. But, as the interrogation proceeded, inconsistencies emerged in Chen's account. He had been alone near the apple display for several minutes. He had access to the pumpkin where Vivian Hartley had left the syringe, and his restaurant, which was still failing despite his protests, would have benefited enormously from the £500 prize money that Mrs. Bantry had promised him he would win. The truth, when it finally emerged, was both more complex and more tragic than anyone had anticipated. Thomas Chen broke down under questioning and admitted that Mrs. Bantry had recruited him into her scheme. She had promised to ensure he won the contest, and would help restore his restaurant's reputation if he helped her with one small task. All he had to do was inject a few apples with what she claimed was harmless food colouring to mark them for judging purposes. Chapter 10. Justice among the jack-o'-lanterns. The final confrontation with Dolly Bantry took place in Miss Marple's sitting room, an appropriately domestic setting for the unmasking of such carefully hidden malice. Inspector Slack had arranged it at Miss Marple's suggestion, reasoning that a formal police interview might prompt Mrs. Bantry to request legal counsel before revealing the full scope of her crimes. Dolly arrived with her usual cheerful demeanour, seemingly unaware that her world was about to collapse. She accepted tea and settled into her customary chair, chatting about village matters with apparent ease. Miss Marple observed her old friend with sadness, recognising how thoroughly greed had corrupted someone she had once trusted. "Dolly," dear Miss Marple began gently, "I'm afraid we need to discuss the events of Halloween evening. Some rather troubling information has come to light." Mrs. Bantry's expression shifted subtly from friendliness to wariness. "I've already told Inspector Slack everything I know, Jane. I can't imagine what more there is to discuss." Inspector Slack stepped forward from where he had been standing quietly near the window. "Mrs. Bantry, we've been examining your financial records and your connections to the competitive costume circuit. We've also spoken extensively with Thomas Chen, who has provided a detailed account of your involvement in the poisoning scheme." The colour drained from Mrs. Bantry's face, but she maintained her composure. "I have no idea what Thomas might have said, but I assure you any accusations are completely false." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Dolly, we know about the prize-fixing network. We know about the payments from costume suppliers. We know you recruited Vivian Hartley to prepare contaminated apples and convinced Thomas Chen to inject them. And we know you substituted cyanide for sedative in the syringe meant for Horace Blackwell's apple." Mrs. Bantry's facade finally crumbled. Her hands trembled and tears began streaming down her face. "You don't understand," she said desperately. "Blackwell was going to destroy me. His investigation would have exposed everything. I would have lost my home, my reputation, my entire life. I had no choice." "You had every choice," Miss Marple replied with quiet firmness. "You chose to build your life on fraud. You chose to recruit desperate people into your schemes. And you chose to commit murder rather than face the consequences of your actions." "But the children," Mrs. Bantry protested weakly. "I never wanted to hurt children. That was supposed to be Vivian's responsibility to ensure the sedative was safe. When I learned she had prepared the materials correctly, I knew I needed something stronger for Blackwell. I thought I could control the situation." Inspector Slack's expression was cold. "You were willing to risk poisoning dozens of children to provide cover for murdering one man. You marked multiple apples to create confusion about your intended victim, and you manipulated Thomas Chen into becoming your accomplice, knowing he was desperate enough to help you without asking too many questions." The full story emerged over the following hours. Mrs. Bantry confessed to everything, including details that only the true perpetrator could have known. She had discovered Horace Blackwell's investigation 3 weeks before the Halloween contest, when a colleague warned her that a prominent critic was asking questions about competition irregularities. Research revealed Blackwell would be in the area for the St. Mary Mead event, and she realised he might use the opportunity to gather final evidence for his exposé. Her plan had been coldly calculated. By contaminating all the apples with sedative and arranging for them to be distributed to children, she could trigger a major health scare that would overshadow any investigation into competition fraud. Blackwell's death from a single poisoned apple would appear to be either accidental or the work of someone with a grudge against him specifically. The marked apples with different initials would provide multiple alternative suspects. "I convinced Thomas that the injections were harmless," Mrs. Bantry admitted. "I told him the marked apples were part of an elaborate judging system. He believed me because he wanted to believe that someone was finally giving him a chance to succeed." She wiped at her tears. Vivian was easier. She was so desperate for money and so naive about what she was really helping accomplish. "And the cyanide?" Miss Marple asked. "How did you obtain it?" Mrs. Bantry's laugh was bitter. "My late husband collected antique photography equipment. His darkroom supplies included several bottles of potassium cyanide for certain developing processes. I've had access to it for years. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. Dolly Bantry was charged with first-degree murder conspiracy and multiple counts of reckless endangerment. Thomas Chen received reduced charges in exchange for his testimony, though his life and business were irreparably damaged. Vivian Hartley faced serious charges, but her cooperation earned her some consideration from the court. Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the case during a quiet evening several weeks later. The Halloween decorations had long since been removed from the village square, and life in St. Mary Mead had returned to its normal rhythms. But the shadow of what had happened lingered in the collective memory. The tragedy, Miss Marple mused to herself, was how many lives had been touched by one woman's greed. Agnes Morton's reputation had been damaged, though she was innocent. Thomas Chen's dream of success had become a nightmare. Vivian Hartley had lost everything pursuing money she should never have wanted, and Horace Blackwell, whatever his faults, had died, simply for doing his job. Inspector Slack visited to provide closure on the case. The prize-fixing network had been dismantled with arrests made across 3 counties. The competition circuit would be reformed with new oversight and regulations. Some good had come from the tragedy, though it seemed small consolation for what had been lost. As Miss Marple sat by her window watching the autumn leaves fall, she thought about how evil could hide behind the most respectable facades. Dolly Bantry had been a pillar. The community trusted and respected by everyone who knew her. Yet beneath that pleasant exterior had lurked a capacity for manipulation and murder that would have shocked anyone who hadn't learned, as Miss Marple had, that human nature contained infinite capacity for both good and evil. The jack-o'-lanterns had long since rotted away, but their empty grins seemed to linger in memory, a reminder that Halloween's masks and disguises were nothing compared to the masks people wore every day. And sometimes Miss Marple reflected those masks only slipped when someone like Horace Blackwell threatened to pull them away and reveal the darkness underneath.